Thank you. Thanks to Leah and the whole staff. It's always such an honor to be a part of this community. And what a kickoff day. The fellows reading was out of the park, and Claire's talk could not have been more appropriate for someone as time and memory obsessed as I am, so thank you. I chose the shortest story I have and did some cutting with the hopes I can read the whole thing and come in under the wire, so I'll get to it. A simple question. There was something in the late winter light that tugged Anna's mind to that day, and she wasn't sure why. Over 25 years had passed, and yet there it was, a gray winter afternoon and a long-ago friend. They were in the parking lot across from the theater, the Colonial. She remembers that part clearly. And she had to walk carefully to avoid lingering patches of ice. She wasn't wearing her boots, having opted to risk the good shoes, but then was sorry not to have the security of hard rubber traction. It was a Sunday in late February, and the whole day had felt like dusk. The show crowd had thinned, and the last of the cars were filing from the lot. They had gone to see Death of a Salesman, the matinee, and while walking around before the show had actually seen Hal Holbrook sitting in a restaurant. Was it really him, they wondered? How could he eat? They stared too long because he smiled and raised his hand. She will never forget that, the image returning so clearly with news of his death. But that day, in the city with Muriel, their words and laughter muffled by scarves and coat collars, it had made her recount having seen a striking man on Boylston Street years before, an elegant camel hair coat and trimmed mustache. She told Muriel she knew it was either Walter Cronkite or Captain Kangaroo, and after a stunned pause had let out a loud, involuntary, "Walter Cronkite." He turned, smiled, and waved, and she was so relieved she hadn't screamed, "Captain Kangaroo." They laughed, and then Muriel said she had something she wanted to ask. How had she said it? "I want to ask you something," or "I have a question." Then she said that perhaps it would be better to wait until they were seated or after the show, better without all the distractions. She said this when Anna stopped to study the menu of a restaurant, suggesting they eat there sometime, perhaps the next time they met for a show. At the time, Anna was thinking a lot about her apartment, a small one-bedroom, fourth-floor walk-up. She was thrilled not to have a roommate, but also missed having someone to share her life, someone, that is, other than Muriel, who people might very well have thought was her mother. Muriel got divorced later that year, so it could have been something about that. Maybe she'd known it was coming and wanted to run her thoughts by someone else. And she often talked about her son, who had left college in the middle of his freshman year and moved back home, so there was another possibility. Anna had thought often what unlikely friends they were. Muriel was twice her age, and yet they had a lot of common interest and taught at the same junior high school, both in language arts. They both loved walking around the city, going to the theater and museums, and they both disliked their principal, a man who stood too close and explained everything in exaggerated enunciation as if talking to a toddler or dog. Or imbecile, Muriel once added. Anna was barely 25 when she took that job and had known no one, so she had welcomed seeing Muriel each day, the wry glances at meetings and laughter at lunch. It had been only natural that they began to get together outside of school. In those early years, Muriel was encouraging in all ways, telling Anna she would have a host of friends in no time, that she was a stellar teacher, that she imagined Anna would soon have all kinds of dates, and then who knew where life would take her. "Enjoy this window," Muriel had said and laughed. You won't believe how quickly things can change. Muriel seemed old at the time, a husband and a child in the 7th grade, a house in the suburbs. She often brought baked goods, bread, or cakes for the break room at school. That was in the very beginning, and Anna relied on her maternal goodness, the care and hopeful future projections of what Anna's life might bring. Back then, when they met, Muriel had said that she was the happiest she had ever been and felt closer to her husband than she ever dreamed possible. Their son had some challenges in school, but he was about to turn 13 and doing so much better. They had hired a tutor. They were hopeful. Such a relief for him to have a friend, she said. Anna wasn't domestic at all in those years, but she loved everything about her tiny apartment, except the pigeons roosting on the windowsill and the squirrels living in the walls. At night, she could hear them, acorns rolling, nails scratching, even though the landlord had assured her that he had it all under control. He said he really doubted they would find a way into the apartment. He said it had only happened once in the 30 years he'd been there. He could set a trap and would if it got worse, but that really is a horrible sound, he said, not to mention that they'd all be smelling it. It's a quandary, he kept saying. And remember, it's almost spring. It was a breezy February day. Valentine hearts and cardboard cupids decorated the window of a stationery shop from the week before, and she recalled Muriel commenting about the groundhog having seen his shadow, more cold coming. She doesn't remember telling Muriel about the squirrels in the wall and the way she could hear them scratching right near her bed, but she must have, especially with the mention of another rodent. She recalled how she had envied those like Muriel with so much of life fixed and decided in their suburban backyards, garage doors that magically opened to a kitchen the size of her whole apartment, a life partner, a child, a pet. She was only at Muriel's home a few times, the son's bar mitzvah her first, and she was only invited because she mentioned in the teacher's lounge that a friend had broken a date and she had nothing to do. Muriel even arranged a ride for her with another teacher in their school. Anna remembered how Muriel's husband had raised a glass and said, "Today you are a man, and tomorrow you go back to 7th grade." Muriel and her husband stood together that day, arms entwined, their son out on the dance floor laughing with a new confidence from this moment of popularity. Another time, Anna was shopping out that way and stopped by to return a book Muriel had loaned her and was invited in at what seemed a stressful time. There was an uncomfortable pause when she found the three of them in the kitchen, sitcom laughter in some distant room. The son was in high school by then, applying to schools, smoking a lot of pot. Muriel said that every time she tried to talk to him to understand what was going on in his life, he said, "You want to know what's wrong with me? How about what the fuck is wrong with you?" The question Anna recalls vividly was the one he asked at his party when he was 13 and reading aloud from a book of riddles he'd received as a gift. The spotlight was on him, and it was clear that his parents were enjoying his getting attention as much as he was. There were all the silly riddles, of course, hands and legs, clocks and chairs, but the one Anna recalls was, what is the question you can ask anywhere in the world, get different answers each time, and yet always be correct? She could see him there, hair cow-licked, crust of chocolate cake on the edge of his mouth. He was an awkward kid who came into the room and everything was instantly topsy-turvy, lampshades crooked and rugs flipped up. It seemed he was always on the verge of nervous laughter because he had a secret or knew something you didn't. In high school, there were suspensions and drugs. He told his mother that he wished he was dead, and then later that he wished she was dead. Muriel had told Anna about this while they were walking Beacon Hill on the third Thursday in May, a day devoted to the annual garden tour when they made their way along the uneven brick sidewalks to peer into tiny, often sunless spaces transformed into paradise, brickwork and elaborate patterns, mirrors and fountains and statues. They read aloud the descriptions in the program, the various plant names like incantations that might open the wrought iron gates and heavy ancient doors that led to other lives, trumpet vine and bleeding heart, astilbe, pulmonaria, laurel, lilac, euonymus. What can a mother say to that, she asked. God. Another day they made up their own tour based on Muriel's idea. Apartments of long-dead writers, 3 on Pinckney Street alone, Alcott and Thoreau and Hawthorne, Plath on Willow and Frost on Mount Vernon. Muriel's idea was that they should read something at each stop, and she had books in her tote with pages carefully marked. They had stood at the foot of Pinckney Street, the river at their backs, before climbing up the hill, and it was there Muriel had pointed to a third-floor bay where she had once lived with 2 other young teachers, a view of the river and a preschool across the street where at recess kids all bundled in snowsuits held onto a long rope with a teacher on each end. If a child started to slip on the icy bricks, they yanked the rope and popped them right back up. I wish you could have known my son when he was a toddler, she had said and smiled. But it was hard to pull together the image of a wind-blown, bundled cherub with the awkward riddle-telling boy, and especially not with that of the angry young man who wished her dead. When I was your age and up in that window, she paused, then shook her head as if to dispel whatever words were coming next, and reached for one of her many quotes selected for the day, Plath's, numb as a fossil, tell me I'm here, to Alcott's, I hate ordinary people. She never let the somber tone last too long, always looking for something that might bring a smile, and perhaps that was what was different on that February day. The lifts were getting harder and harder to find. And for Anna, it was getting harder and harder to listen to the sadness and the denial in her voice, the blame of the boy's father, his teachers. It was hard to respond to the regret and grief. That episode his freshman year, everything seemed okay, and then, how many times had Muriel told that story? He drained his bank account and got out on the highway. They had no idea where he was, and it was days before he called from a motel in Tucson without any money. Her husband had called her an enabler, said he couldn't take it, and then got a divorce, a new wife, a new life, but that was all later, of course. And information Anna only heard secondhand from another teacher in the school who lived in the same town. That day at the theater, Muriel had checked her phone often, a weak smile if she saw Anna notice. But what was the question? There's something I want to ask you, she had said. Did she wait for intermission, or did they never circle back? They had great seats, Hal Holbrook completely transformed into Willie Loman, and afterward when they stood in the parking lot and talked about the play, how Linda Loman said he's only a little boat looking for a harbor. They marveled at the power of those words and the effect of staring at the set, the house where they had lived and struggled, while also seeing what was not on stage, the distant crash of Willie's car wrapped around a tree, the shocking end of it all. And what about those haunting last words? We're free, a mortgage all paid, something completed, and yet. Anna will remember that for the rest of her life. That February day, the sharp smell of the river ready to thaw, exhaust from the turnpike trapped in the low ceiling of gray. We're free. At some point in one of the many conversations along the way, Anna said it was absolutely clear Muriel's son needed treatment, perhaps serious medication, or tough love, as she'd read about recently and seen on television, Oprah or Jane Pauley, someone talking in the background while she straightened her apartment for another day and looked forward to going out with friends her own age. Finally, friends her own age, too many friends it seemed, and a relationship that would carry her into the future and her real life. I bet once he gets straightened out, his dad will want to return, and then you'll have a decision, she had told Muriel. That will be a big decision, won't it? Whether or not you let him come back. And what about someday when your son gets married? You can tell all those stories to his fiancée, and everyone will laugh. Now she shudders with the memory. Muriel smiled, or what at the time seemed a smile, as if to say, "Oh yes, how smart, you are so right." As if suddenly the light blared through and she realized something she hadn't seen before. And yet now isn't it obvious that what she was really thinking was, "Oh, my dear ignorant friend, you know nothing. Wait until you have children. Wait until the person you vowed to share through thick and thin can't take it anymore. Just you wait." But she also was above saying such a thing. The words, "just you wait," would not have occurred to someone like Muriel. What time is it? That was the answer to that long ago riddle, the universal question that yields different answers, but all correct. A 13-year-old boy stands in the spotlight, his 5 minutes of glory, proud parents with their arms entwined, kids from school gathered around him, new suit, shiny belt and shoes, a tie purchased just for the occasion. His party, his celebration, his step into manhood. On that day, he had friends and proud parents and the gift of not knowing all that lay ahead of him. And here she is, years and miles from that day, in a town not unlike Muriel's, where children wait in front of the house for the school bus to arrive, a place where the local news reports are the kind that get laughed at by the rest of the world. Someone dumped trash in the recycling bin at the grocery store. A squirrel was in a tree acting strange. Heads of cabbage were tossed around and left on the school ground. Why? Now standing at the sink, making the bed, staring out the window, grading papers, the thought of all the words not spoken seizes her. Dear Muriel, she thinks, dear Muriel. And she thinks how sometimes the universe gives an answer before we understand the question. There in the dark theater, there at the end, they sat in silence. The scene plays, and even knowing what is coming, they are shocked by the crash, shocked by the humbling sense of loss and the awareness of how vulnerable each life. Muriel has been dead for several years now, her son as well, and yet each time Anna remembers, there's shock. By the time she heard about Muriel's illness, Anna was at a different school, and it was only by chance she ran into an old colleague who mentioned it. Muriel's years with her son and the sad choice he made, then her own health issues she kept to herself. This question comes to Anna. If she went to the city and walked those same steps, could she see something? Hal Holbrook in a restaurant, death of a salesman on the marquee, Willie Loman resurrected and once again filled with hopeful promises. Would she see her young self step from her dark apartment and hurry along the city streets to see Muriel waiting there on the corner with a big smile, hands deep in the pockets of her down coat? They sat that day, elbows touching, not a sound to be heard in the theater as their minds fixed on the imagined accident in the distance, the same way her mind now can't think of Muriel's old house without seeing her son hanging there in the mud room where a little Tykes tractor had grown invisible over the years. But that day, after the curtain call, after the lights came up, they walked outside where it was almost dark and lingered in the parking lot. It was their last outing. Anna's almost sure of that now. And what did she even do in her apartment that she rushed back to that day? She was so eager to get home, hands in pockets and head bent to the cold, and urgency in her steps as she walked the many blocks. Did she stop in Blockbuster for a rental, DeLuca's for something she couldn't afford to eat? Did she call her still living parents or wait until the next day to avoid the slow Sunday blues that plagued her for much of her young life? Did she watch something mindless on television, knit, grade papers? Did she even wonder what it was Muriel had wanted to ask? Or was she distracted by the fact that there were squirrels in the walls and a pigeon roosting on her bedroom windowsill that overlooked an alley and dumpster? And she had boxes to pack, a move up ahead. She was moving into her life. It was a dark Sunday in February when she had no husband, no children, no mortgage. Her parents were alive and far away, healthy enough that she could complain about her conversations with them and not worry for a minute. She hadn't known what it felt like for a parent to die, or for a marriage to feel threatened, for a child to lash out in anger. She hadn't known how sometimes you just need someone to listen. That day, she had walked quickly, protecting shoes she tossed out 20 years ago, then climbed the 4 flights of stairs to her dark, tiny space where an old radiator whined and some creature with no sense of time clawed at the walls to get free. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And now a great honor to share the stage with wonderful Carl Phillips.
Hi. Okay. Thank you, Jill, for that terrific story. And thank you, Leah and Gwen and Adam, for having me back. Can you hear this, what I'm saying? Okay, great. And I'm talking slowly because I realize I'm in some panic state, but it's all going to be fine. So, fine. I'm going to read from a brand new book that is not actually out. It's out in August, but this is like the soft launch. Is that what they call it? So it's like specially available here at Sewanee for the first time. So there's that. So I'm going to read from it for the first time. Okay, so here's some poems. There won't be more than 12. I have a feeling one's going to fall away. I'm going to start my little timer. All right, regime. As I took off my clothes, I watched him taking his own off. The sound of rain was for once not the sound of wind shaking the rain steadily loose from a stand of river birch. It's hard to believe in them, the beautiful colors of extinction. But these are the colors. This is called Before All of This. And as usual, early summer seems already to hold inside it the split fruit of late fall, those afternoons whose diminished music will soon enough lie down in, surprised a little, to feel it all surprised. Meanwhile, how the wind sometimes makes the slenderest trees, still young, bend over, makes me think of knowledge conquering superstition. I can almost believe in that until the trees, like fear, spring back. Then a sad sort of quiet just after, as between two people who have finally realized they've stopped regretting the same things. It's like they've never known each other. Yet even now, waking, they insist they've woken from a dream they share, forgetting all over again that every dream is private. Whatever the reasons are for the dead underbranches of the trees that flourish here, that the dead persist is enough. For me, it's enough. The air stirs like history, like the future, like history. All right, I'm calming down a bit. This is called Vikings. Vikings were real people. The Vikings thought the wind was a god, and that the eyes were holes. A window meant a wind eye for the god to see with, and at the same time through. I used to hate etymology. What's the point? I'd whisper. I was quieter back then, less patient, though more easily pleased. I am pleased to have been of use, I used to say to myself after sex with strangers. Leaning hard against the upstairs window, I'd watch them make their half-proud, half-ashamed-looking way wherever. And if it was autumn, whether in fact or only metaphorically, I'd watch the yard fill with leaves, then with what I at first thought was urgency, though it usually turned out just to be ambition. I'd leave the window open, as I do now. If closed, I open it, then pull the drapes shut across it, which, of the many I've tried, remains the best way I know still to catch a wind god breathing. All right, this poem is called Refrain, and thanks Adam and Eric who kindly published it in the Sewanee Review recently. And for some reason I feel the need to say that a palisade, at least in my mind, what it used to be is a kind of fencing around a fortress. So, refrain. My fortress has many windows. From this one, I can tell the tide's going out. I can see the small purplish flowers further up from the water that you never stopped calling sea thistle, though that's still not right. The ring of aspens that surround my fortress, that of course know nothing of east or west or love when scattered in all its countless definitions, form a natural palisade that in leafless months can seem especially severe, but somehow as well inviting. How forgiveness might look in the face, say, if it had a face, and forgiveness were real. My fortress is cold and windless. It's a choice not to step from it. I believe in gift as much, I think, as I believe in mastery. Even your mistakes were delicate. I don't say a lot between poems. There seems to be nothing to say. So here's another poem. This is the title poem. It's called Scattered Snows to the North, which someone told me is a very gay title. But I am in fact gay, so what else would my titles be? Scattered Snows to the North. Does it matter that the Roman Empire was still early in its slow unwinding into never again? Then, as now, didn't people burst into tears in front of other people or in private for no reason that they were willing to give, or they weren't yet able to, or for just no reason? I've never stopped missing you, I used to practice saying, for when I'd need those lines, as I assumed I would, given what I knew then, nothing really, about things like love, trust, the betrayal of trust, and a willfulness that's only deepened inside me all these years during which I can almost say I've missed no one, though it hurts to say it. Honestly, the Roman Empire, despite my once having studied it, barely makes any sense to me now, past the back and forthing of patrolled borders as the gauge and proof of hunger's addictive and erosive powers. But there were people, of course, too, most of them destined to be unremembered, who filled in their drawn lives anyway, because what else is there to where the edges gave out? If it was night, they lit fires, presumably. Tears were tears. Western edge. I need you the way astonishment, which is really just the disruption of routine, requires routine. Isn't there a shock, though, a thrill, to having done what we had to? Unequally, but in earnest, we love as we can, he used to mumble. Not so much his mouth moving, more the words themselves sort of staggering around, lost inside it. Now, show me exactly what you think being brave is. All right, this is called Surfers. Oh, there's not a theme. I hate gimmicks and patterns, but in books. But you'll notice there are periodically poems that are groups of people. Like we have Vikings. Now we have surfers. Surfers. Probably this morning's surfers aren't that much different from the ones I used to watch nearly 50 years ago, whose glamour seemed so much more fixed, more absolute from a distance than when they got too close, which is the fault not of myth, but of turning people into myth. I was a kid then, and they were more or less men. Soon they'd be men for real, meaning more or less boys. They rarely smiled at me. They never touched me. They mostly pretended not to notice me, though one time, watching them from where I'd hidden in a stretch of dune grass, I could see a couple of them with hands raised to their eyes, scanning the dunes as if searching, and I stood up, unhid myself, and I could tell they'd missed me. Toward nightfall, I'm a lighthouse. I'm a lighthouse, I'd sing to myself, but very softly, because boys aren't lighthouses. That's nonsense. Repeat after me. I could never have guessed at it back then, this second life. It was all I could do, just to be patient, as they paddled their boards out again, into the waves. Then they'd catch one, and flashing my arms, extended in front of me like the twin beams of light that softly they'd always been also, I'd guide the men in, to shore, then closer, as if there were a choice that summer, or ever, and I'd chosen, and I could almost still see it from here. This poem's called Like So. Strangely enough, it took months for me to come up with that original title. I think it was just despair, and I thought, that'll do. All right. Like so. From attention to adoration is a smallish distance, and yet no arrow, no boat with sail can cross it, like the mind's insistence. We'd reached the marshes by then that all the dead must come to. I could see my face tilted there, like a solar eclipse viewed indirectly, which is the proper way, in a basin of water. You must hold it steady. Keep the basin safe from the wind's reach, its competing powers of revelation and distortion. Okay, you ready for another group? Troubadours. Life itself being a ramble of mystery, pattern, accident, and surprise. We took heart in knowing whatever road we were on must be the right one, or anyway, we believed it was, and belief still counts. We pressed forward. We weren't afraid, nor unafraid. We stopped briefly to watch the broad leaves, discolored now, of a catalpa fall onto and get carried off by the river whose course, more or less, we'd been following too. The leaves fell as if to a song called "Come When I Tell You To." The water received the leaves like a slightly different song, until spoken to, shut up, no one's asking, did I ask you a question? Songs like that, which is how we learned what we should have known already, that sometimes to remember a thing can hurt more than the thing itself ever did long ago, back when hurt was a feeling still, not a memory, not an art yet. Permission to stop listening, sir, please. And we turned away, kept heading whereverward, until wherever became night. How close abundance is to excess, across whose borders lies too far gone anymore to care. A place we'd heard about, sure, plenty, but not yet seen. We made our camp at the border. The air had turned windless. The trees grew quiet, like thinking. That animals aren't human, but humans are animals. It almost sounds like part of a riddle or the wrong answer to one, to do as much with obedience as with what's fair, at least one of us thought, but kept for now to himself. Variously, we slept, or in the otherwise dark, pretended to. The only fires we lit were private ones, black into blue. Okay, there are 3 more poems. This is called Fist and Palm. Fist and Palm. That felt great when I was doing it in my room. I thought, I'll do that so they get the title. Fist and Palm. There are plenty who'd hardly recognize me now. I used to be that cruel, by which I mean I was frightened mostly, and now I'm mostly not. Joy, if only flickeringly, each day astounds me. The man I used to be dismounts, relents for a bit, before digging his boots, streaked with longing, my own longing, what I can't help, hard into my sides again, into the man I've become. His way of reminding me we've only stopped for rest, a short rest, some water. We've years to go still. He has his job. I have mine. Speechlessness is not an option, he whispers into my ear. He spits on the words themselves after, as if to make them stay, or just to make sure I'm listening. But I'm always listening, as I always obey. Isn't this obedience? These songs I've built from things too difficult to speak of. Gladiators. Each had been terrible enough to himself already, to that truest self inside, as only he could know it. So it seemed it should matter less what ways in particular they'd been terrible to each other, or even that they'd been terrible at all. Likewise, whether death mattered or not wasn't the point, had never been, They understood this now. Bird crossing sky, sky getting crossed, the sky after that. They believed about suffering that its special power is to define, even as it displaces it, everything it touches. They held on to each other. I'm going to finish with this poem called Rehearsal, which is how the book ends. Rehearsal. By then, the point of the forest was the getting through it. Then it lay behind them, all but its sharper details, flies licking at dried blood, I think, on a random tree stump, getting swiftly lost, its muffled bird song, too, that had come less, it seemed, from the trees than from beneath mostly, as if somewhere deep, deep inside the earth. Maybe meeting you has been the one good reason I lasted so long in a world that must eventually not include me, I almost said to him. Past the forest, the shore, where the land ended, where briefly the waves hitting it seemed the latest example of how squandering momentum can become routine, while upon the waves, the taken for grantedness of shadow play seemed its own example, how one way to prove power can be to quietly assume it. Then, except for offshore, where the dark lay like, defiantly, a ship at anchor, everything was itself, as it always had been. They took off their shoes, their clothes. They swam out to the dark ship. Thanks so much.